we were going to talk about the governance of food system and food system transformation. Next, please, Bram. So now, before we actually dive into the topic of today, I wanted to ask people if they have ever heard of those two concepts of confirmation bias and motivated reasoning. And here I'm not trying to impose, any academic. It's not. It's actually for those of you who are not familiar with those two concepts, which actually derive from political psychology. The idea behind those concepts is that people's ability to judge or to assess a fact, an evidence, or a statement is usually influenced by whether that statement or that evidence is aligned or is in disagreement with their own political beliefs. So what it means that me as an academic, but you as a technical advisor or the policymakers you are working with, everyone is somehow unconsciously biased by our own political ideas. Let me give you an example, which is called the Danish experiment. So in that example, local politicians in Denmark were tasked to assess schools. And what was found is that those politicians were much less likely to correctly assess or identify whether a public school or a private school were performing well, depending on whether the answer clashed with their own ideological preferences. So why am I telling you that? Next, please. Well, I'm telling you that because if we were to do the same experiment and ask you to answer the question which is right here on the slide, it's likely that your answer will not depend on the evidence that you are provided with, but rather your political preference. And this is exactly why talking about the governance of food system is a very tricky topic. Next, please. So today, we are actually going to talk about the governance of food system. And the key question related to that topic is, what is the right model, or even is there a right model? And to feed the discussion that you will have after the lectures, I propose to revisit the two slightly provocative statements that you have already discussed just before the presentation. So first, the fact that at the present time, the food system is locked by powerful actors that prevent him from moving out of his current status quo. And second statement, that there is not enough political will amongst the other key actors to align the objective of the system toward a more sustainable transformation. Next, please. At least if there's something that people agree on at the present time is that our food system are not in great shape. And here I'm just using a quote from the Eat Lancet report, which called upon a great transformation. But several other panel of experts before the Eat Lancet report has exactly concluded the same thing. Our system is not sustainable and we need to change something. For me, the interesting question, of course, is not what needs to be changed, but how we are going to do it. Next, please. So you would have seen Josh's great video, I'm hoping a couple of days ago, still about the system transformation. So transformation in a common sense, in the colloquial meaning, if you want, means radical structural change. What is important to realize is that obviously food systems have been transforming. In fact, they have never stopped transforming. One famous example is the supermarketization of food system that has characterized countries in Latin America, Africa, Asia in the last 20 years. But other examples include the Green Revolution, of course, but also the shift toward monoculture, the westernization of diet that took place in Asia, or the widespread use of GMO, and perhaps the next, even before the great transformation, will be the shopping online. The point being that in that conventional sense, transformation refer to change that are drastic, rapid, and affect the structure or the functioning of the system, but does not necessarily lead to always positive outcomes. Next, please. Now, more recently, the term started to also be used in a slightly different way. This time, people started to attach a normative dimension to the term. So, taken with that normative component, transformation refer not just to drastic, rapid changes, but rather to deliberate and tender changes in a desirable and hopefully positive direction that would lead to a better system. And here I'm using two quotes from two groups of experts where I highlighted the positive aspect that transformation are now expected to bring. So the first quote from Blyth and his colleagues mentioned transformation presented as inherently good and leading to sustainability, while the second quote from Barrett and his colleagues tell us that transformation are expected to lead us to, and I quote, a coherent, just, well-integrated and sustainable system. Next, please. So in sum, we are moving from an interpretation of transformation where transformation was about the change itself, but not necessarily the outcome. In fact, those outcomes could therefore be positive, but also negative. The engine of change is technological innovation, and those innovations are themselves driven by the market dynamics and in particular profit, which means that at the end of the process, or at the end of the day, the process is what I would say random. Sometimes it leads to good innovation, sometimes it leads to not so good innovation, at least from a sustainability perspective. So we move, next please, Bram. So we move from that to a new interpretation of transformation, where this time transformation is given, as I was saying, a normative dimension, in particular expected to lead to positive outcomes. The process is not random anymore, but instead is intended, wanted. The engine may still be technological innovation, but this may require something else, since, as we just said, innovation by themselves are driven by profit, not by sustainability. And here we have a clear directionality with the idea that this leads us toward more sustainability. Next, please. So we see the $1 million question now is, how do we pass from a random transformation to a normative transformation? What is, or even is there, a governance model that allows us to do that? At the present time, and next please, maybe at the risk of slightly oversimplifying a bit the landscape, we could say that there is currently three big types of governance model. On one hand of the spectrum, we have the market model, where the private sector is in the driving seat. It is the laissez-faire economic approach, where in particular tools like self-regulation are promoted as the way to govern the system. On the other hand of the spectrum, we have the command and control model, where this time governments are in the driving seat. It's a much more top-down approach, obviously, and the tools that are usually used to in that model are regulation, laws, subsidies, a bit of a mix of carrot and stick. Next, please. And now in the middle, you have what is called hybrid models, where this time it's not just the private sector or the government which are in the driving seat, but a combination of multi-actors, including those private sectors and government, but also civil societies, citizen groups, in what is called, well, there's different names for that. So it could be called participatory or deliberative democracy, polycentric governance, multi-level governance, even neo-multilateralisms when you take into account the international institution. And the general tools here are very diverse, but a good example would be the PPP, the private-public partnership. Next, please. And in a recent report by the Food and Land Use Coalition, I don't know if you have been presented with that in the previous lectures, but in that report, for instance, the expert suggested that for the food system transformation to happen, we need at least 5 different types of actors: government, business and private sectors producers, but also investors and financial institutions, multilateral and international organization, and of course, citizens and consumers. Next, please. Now, what is important to understand is that at the end of the day, answering the question of what is the best governance model to lead the food system transformation is a political question. It's not a technical or a scientific question. And this is exactly why I was mentioning at the beginning of this presentation the issues of confirmation bias or motivated reasoning. Because for most people, answering that particular question of best governance model is not influenced by evidence, but by political ideology. Next, please. Now, what I want to do is to share with you some of what we know about the current governance of food system. And this is where I'm making those, as I said, somewhat provocative statements. The first is that food systems are currently controlled and locked by a group of powerful actors, which is called the big food, which have strong interest to maintain the current status quo. And the second statement we're going to look at is that there's a sort of irreconcilable divergence between the other actors, in particular the government and the consumers, and that prevent them from being able to align their objective and their values and create the political will that would be necessary to counteract the big food. Next, please. So let's start with the first of those two statements. As certainly some of you already know, the agri-food system is one of the most concentrated sectors of the world economy. And the figure here shows that from the very upstream part of the system, with seed, agrochemical, fertilizer, all the way down to the retail industry and the supermarket, the food system is controlled by a very few companies. What you also need to know, however, is that the economic literature agree that when more than 40% of the market are controlled by 4 companies or less, there is no longer effective competition in the sector. And when more than 60% of the market is controlled by 4 companies, we are in an oligopolistic position. Next, please. So what are the implications of such a huge concentration of power and resources in the end of the queue? Well, the first implication is the fact that those resources allow those companies to set the term of the debate and to shape policies through, obviously, lobbying activities, what can be called also the power of influence, but also simply through the scale effect. Some of those companies are so big, or they control so much of the market, that if and when they decide to change some of their commercial strategy, that effectively affects a lot of people, sometimes a whole continent. Now, the second way big food influence the process is through the use of their research and development. In theory, research and development are expected to boost innovation. In reality, data suggests that it's not always necessarily the case. In fact, what happened is that those actors use their own research and development resources to maintain their control over the market. So instead of having research and development leading to a new product, what we have is actually fewer innovation that we should have. And the OECD just released a report last week that actually confirmed that. Much earlier data from the US Federal Trade Commission actually also show that. They found that there was a negative correlation between the level of concentration of the sector and the level of innovation. And that relates to what people call the concept of defensive research and development, where companies will use their resources to protect their own existing product or investment instead of developing new products. And obviously, the bigger the company, the bigger the resources, and the bigger the capacity is to protect their own assets and their interests against newcomers. Next, please. Now, the second statement is about the existence of those irreconcilable objectives between various key actors, including government and consumers. And for instance, I'm going to argue that it will be impossible to promise people that they're going to be able to eat whatever they want, and at the same time reduce the impact of food system to a sustainable level. And to demonstrate that, I'm going to use the case of red meat. So for red meat, we know what it would take to stay within the boundary of the planet boundaries. It will require a greater than 50% reduction in production and consumption of red meat at the global level. Next, please. Yet, what do we have? Well, at the present time, and with the exception of Africa and South Asia, the consumption of red meat exceeds by between 300 and 600% the reference diet intake, which was suggested by the Eat Cancer report. And projections indicate that 3 billion people are expected to continue increasing their consumption of red meat in the next 20 years. Of course, boosted by that growth in demand, production is also projected to increase by another 19 million tons in the next 10 years. So, and you can see on the figure, although it's a bit small, sorry for that, but what the figure shows is that while low and middle income countries will contribute a vast majority of that increase, with in particular China and Brazil, first and third producers, the US will also continue to be a major player. In fact, the US is the second largest producer of red meat after China. Next, please. What is important to know is that in those three countries, US, Brazil, and China, but also in many others, the government are still actively supporting the industry. In the US, for instance, Tyson and Smithfield, which are two of the largest actors of the sectors, have received on aggregate between the two of them more than $570 million per year of subsidy. In China, the pork industry has been receiving about $20 billion per year, which make it about $47 per pig. And in Brazil, the federal government, the one at the top, is actually a shareholder of JBS, and JBS is simply the largest meat producer in the world. So those are some of the facts, some of the evidence that people need to keep in mind when they were to try to decide how we could or how we should start changing the system. In some, what that slide is showing is that while we knew that the private sector is part of the problem, consumers and government have also their share of responsibility in creating or maintaining the problem. Next, please. Okay, so for the discussion, there's many other points I didn't bring in, essentially because in 20 minutes you can't hope to touch on every aspect of food system governance. And if you do so, you're gonna have to stay in a very superficial manner. So I prefer to dive into two of them. But if you want to bring in some of the topic, then what I did not talk about, but are important in relation to food system governance, is the small actors, who at the present time are not well represented in most countries at the national level. Second, the fact that the agri-food industry is the economic sectors with the highest prevalence of child and forced labor in the world. And that's the vast majority of the people involved in food system activities are working in the informal sectors, especially in low and middle income countries. Third, the potential critical role of consumers. And the fact that while consumers are very often presented as a potential positive driver or even a solution, they are also very often supporting or creating negative trends. We saw earlier the figures regarding the increase in demand of red meat. And then finally, the fact that while the big food may be hijacking innovation to protect their own interests, other private sector, often smaller, can have a much more positive approach on it. So that leads me to some of the key questions I think could be a good start for you following the discussion.